Hello, everyone. Let me define again research. Research is a process of steps used to collect and analyze information in order to increase our knowledge about a topic or issue. Most research involves at least three steps. Posing a question. That's why I always emphasize that the problem is in interrogative statement. And after posing the question, you're going to collect data about the question. Then make an analysis of the data to answer the question. So generally, we have three steps in this slide. Posing a question, and that question is a research question. Then collecting data about the question. Then analyzing the data to answer the question. Why do we need to read research reports? And this is actually part of the review of related literature. I mentioned that you have to undergo intensive review of related literature when you have identified the research problem or the research issue or the issue itself, or maybe the need or the gap in general. So number one, to add your professional knowledge. Number two, to inform your position in policy debates. There are actually some policies that are based on research findings, and that ideally, when someone would make a policy, that policy is actually based on research findings. The next one is to improve your practice. As a teacher, you're going to improve your practice, not just by reading, but based on research findings. Why do you adopt this kind of teaching strategy? Because research findings shows that this strategy is effective. Why are you using this kind of assessment technique? Because the research findings show that this is actually an effective assessment. Research may offer new programs or strategies to try. Research may present new ideas to consider. Research can help you learn about evaluating alternative approaches. There might be many approaches, but you are going to evaluate them on which one is the best one, which one is effective, which one is not effective. And we are able to have that kind of evaluation too, based on research findings. Although I repeated this one already, but I would like to repeat this for emphasis. What steps do researchers take when conducting their studies? So number one, identifying a research problem. Specifying a problem, justifying its importance, arguing for the need to study that kind of problem to different audiences. It might be a problem, it might be an issue, it might be a need. No? So when we talk about problem, it's not only problem itself, but it could be an issue, it could be a need, or it could be a gap that is actually being identified. Number two, reviewing the literature. Selecting sources about the problem, summarizing the sources, critically evaluating the sources. Why you're going to evaluate the sources? Because there might be a case that these are not the best literature that would actually support your problem, and be able to look at different sources, credible sources. If you look at journal, we look at journals that are credible. There might be some cases that journals are predatory, and that findings in their researchers in there are not actually the best researchers in the world, but they are just in there for the sake of publishing their different research findings. So why you are going to have a review of related literature? Because at the very beginning, when you have identified the problem, you might not have the best idea on how are you going to undergo your research process. How are you going to make your research proposal? So basically, you're going to read different literature. You're going to read the work of many scientists, many researchers, and that After reading, you will be able to come up with ideas. How are you going to make your own? What will be step number 1? What will be step number 2? What will be step number 3? So forth and so on. What variables are to be included and what variables are not to be included? And how are you going to define those different variables? I mentioned in my lecture, in my other videos, that variables are to be well defined. And that when we say well defined, you know already what is to be included in that variable and you know what are not to be included in that variable. Specifically, without confusion, you are able to identify what is meant by that variable, what is the inclusion of that variable, what are not included in that variable. That is what I mean about the well-defined variable. So in the review of related literature, you will be able to have that idea that you can continue that kind of research proposal because that kind of problem is not yet being answered, not being solved, and that there is no duplication of that kind of problem because reading the literature, your statement of the problem is not actually answered. It must be unanswered research question in such a way that reviewing the related literature, there's none in there that could answer your interrogative statement problem. Number 3, specifying the purpose. Stating the study's intent and the focus, narrowing the purpose to research questions or hypotheses. When you are going to look up into the purpose or the objectives, or in general, we look up into the specific statement of the problem, we have to look up into the acronyms part. That it is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and then time-bounded. When we look up into being specific, you know already that in that kind of problem, you know what are to be included and you know what are not to be included. There's no confusion on what are you going to focus, what are you going to consider, and you are able to define each variable that are being found in the research problem. Number 4, choosing a research design. I mentioned in our previous lectures and even in those different videos that I let you watch that there are many designs. And basically, we have the 3 major research designs: the qualitative research design, the quantitative research design, and then the mixed research design. The quantitative is actually dealing with the variables that have numerical values or values in terms of numbers. The qualitative are actually those kind of methods where the variables are actually in terms of categorical values, not in terms of numbers. Then we have the mixed method. The mixed method is a combination of quantitative and qualitative, where the values are actually either numeric or in terms of numbers or categorical or both. Values are actually categorical and some are actually in terms of numbers or in terms of figures. Then later, we're going to look up into the specific qualitative research designs, the specific quantitative research designs, and the specific mixed research designs. The next one, number 5, is all about selecting participants and collecting data. So we look up into the population of the entire study. You look at the entire population and define that entire population. It must be a well-defined population. And after that, if the population is so big that you could not afford to collect the data from all members of the population, then you're going to have sample. Sample is representative of the entire population. So along the way, we're going to look at into different sampling designs. Although the sampling designs are actually part of the statistical methods, but in here, we're going to have a quick discussion about different sampling designs. So if the population is big, then you have to identify a sampling design where you can actually collect the data from that sample. And the sample represents the entire population. When the population is small and you have the resources, the financial resources to collect the data from all members of that small population, then you can actually collect that data from that population. And remember, if data are being collected from the entire members of the population, you are actually doing census. However, if you are collecting the data from a sample, then you are actually doing a survey. So take note on the difference of a survey and census. Census is actually looking into the collection of data from all members of the population, and survey is collecting data from the sample. Number 6, analyzing data and reporting results. So break down the data. You're going to look at the tables. You're going to look at the charts. You're going to look at the figures and analyze what's the meaning of these different data. What is the trend of the data? Is it decreasing? Is it actually increasing? Is it fluctuating? What are the different meanings of those data as found in the table, as found in the figure, as found in the chart? You have to make sense of the data. Remember, numbers presented without description are actually meaningless. You're going to represent the data. As I mentioned, represent the data in terms of tables, in terms of graphs, in terms of charts, and what's the meaning of those different data in the graph. What is the meaning of those different data found in the table? What is the meaning of those different data found in the figures? So, number 7 is on drawing conclusions. So, drawing conclusions is of relating the study results to literature. When you are going to have that kind of finding, relate that one to the literature that you have actually included in the manuscript or in your thesis. We have related literature section. So based on the findings, you're going to relate that one to the literature. Identify limitations of the study. What are the limitations of the study? In all studies, there are actually limitations. We could not afford to look at all angles in the study. So in some cases, or in most cases, we have to do some limitations of the study. And there are actually things that happened along the way that is actually beyond your control. So for example, when you look up into an experiment in a social science perspective, you have the experimental and the control group, and these are actually composed of individuals. And if someone would like to transfer to another school during the conduct of your experiment, then that's actually beyond your control. You could not just say to that specific student, that concerned student, please do not transfer because I'm still conducting an experiment. We have to finish the experiment before you transfer. We could not do that. So that's part of the limitation. When you look at into planting in agriculture, for example, when you have the experimental and the control, and in the experimental, a certain plant variety that you have included in your study dies, then that is actually beyond your control. That is part of the limitation. If you're talking about animals in the control group, that certain animal dies, then that is actually beyond your control. So in all studies, there are actually limitations, and you're going to consider that one in the process of making conclusion. What are the limitations of the conclusion that you have formulated based on the results of the findings, or based on the what you have found in the entire data that you have collected, that you have presented or organized, that you have analyzed, and that you have interpreted. Then you are going to look at into suggestions that would actually have some implications for practice and for future research. So in there, we look at also the recommendation side of the entire research process. The last one is on disseminating and evaluating the research. Sharing the research with audiences. You're going to present the findings, the entire research study together with the findings in a conference, in a seminar, or maybe in a workshop. And then in the dissemination, you have to go back to what you have mentioned in the significance of the study. Remember, in the significance of the study, you have identified people, you have identified professionals, you have identified persons, or maybe agencies, or maybe companies, organizations that could benefit the findings of the study. So in that section, significance of the study, you have pointed out those different companies, different organizations, different groups, different professionals, different individuals, different persons that could benefit the findings of the study. So in the dissemination, you have to go back to what you have mentioned in the significance of the study, and then emphasize, or you're going to disseminate the findings of your study. Another thing is on the publication of the research findings together with the entire research article. Why? Because you have to publish that one so that it could have benefit, so that everyone knows on what are the specific findings of this kind of problem, this kind of issue, this kind of need. And so that the community, the public would actually have that awareness on possible solutions, possible recommendations to that kind of problem. And having that the wide dissemination of the findings of your study is actually mandatory. Do not just actually have a hardbound copy of your thesis, of your research, then put that into the shelf. No, that's not the case. Because you have to disseminate that one to the target population, to the sample that you have actually included in your study, and all those people, those persons that you have included in the significance of the study. I can remember that there's a superintendent that when a student asks permission to collect data in the division, the superintendent has a remark on the paper: approved, provided that you are going to disseminate the findings of the study upon completing your entire study at Negros Oriental State University College of Teacher Education. And that's actually the practice. Because normally, when you have collected the data and then after that, you have done all the entire research processes, you have completed the thesis or the research, then you never go back to the area where you have collected the data, the division where you have collected the data, the company where you have collected the data until the findings. So that's not the case. So you have to go back there and then disseminate the findings of your study. And then about evaluating the research process or the entire research, that's why there's what we call oral defense. Now, oral defense. Our oral defenses will be based on number one, proposal. The number two is on the pre-orals, and then the last one is on the final orals. So in our case, when we look up into the proposal, it's only about chapter 1. When we look up into the pre-oral defense, that is actually composed of chapter 1, chapter 2, and then chapter 3. And when we look at into the final oral defense, we look at again chapter 1, chapter 2, and then chapter 3. And we look at into whether you have completed, you have complied all the comments, suggestions of the panel members during the pre-oral defense. And during the pre-oral defense, the checking is on whether you have followed the comments, the suggestions of the panel members during the proposal defense. And that the proposal defense is composed only of chapter 1. So in our college, in Negros Oriental State University, from undergraduate to graduate programs, we only have 3 chapters. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, and then Chapter 3. Chapter 1, problem and its scope. The problem and its scope. Again, Chapter 1, the problem and its scope. Chapter 2 is all about the presentation, analysis, and interpretation of data. Presentation, analysis, and interpretation of data. The last chapter, chapter 3, is all about summary, findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So we only have 3 chapters. In other schools, in other universities, in other colleges, they have 5 chapters. So chapter 1, the problem and its scope. Chapter 2 is all about the review of related literature. Chapter 3 is all about research methodology. Chapter 4 is all about presentation, analysis, and interpretation of data. Chapter 5, summary, findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So when you look at the difference between a 5-chapter thesis and a 3-chapter thesis, the difference is on actually the numbering. But in terms of the contents are actually the same. Because in the 5 version, we have chapter 1, the problem and its scope. Chapter 2, review of related literature. Chapter 3 is all about research methodology. But all of these 3 chapters, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, are now chapter 1 in a 3-version chapter thesis. So chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3 in a 5-version thesis format are being included in chapter 1 in a 3-version thesis. So chapter 1 in a 3-chapter version thesis includes the problem and its scope, includes the review of related literature, includes about the research methodology. So all of the 3 chapters in a 5-chapter version thesis are being incorporated as chapter 1 in a 3-chapter version. Chapter 4 in a 5-version thesis becomes chapter 2 in a 3-version thesis. Then chapter 5, the summary, findings, conclusions, and recommendations are now included as chapter 3 in a 3-chapter version. Remember, in a 3-chapter version, chapter 3 is all about summary, findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So take note of the differences about a 5-chapter version and a 3-chapter version. There's a difference on the number of chapters, but there's no difference in terms of the contents. So take note of that. So with those different things that I mentioned in this video, I would say see you next video.